Welcome to the March the 21st, 1988 taping of It Happened in Grand Prairie, as we bring back the memories of Grand Prairie of the past and also bring you up to date on some of the happenings of those that may have had a part or have had some interest in Grand Prairie's past. And today, this is our history tape number 64, and we are very pleased to have a very special gentleman with us today. Mr. Willard C. Schultz is a retired public relations director at the regional level with the Union Pacific Railroad. And as you in Grand Prairie know, we have a wonderful railroad coming right down through the northern section of our city from the east to the west, and it originally was the Texas and Pacific Railroad. And Mr. Schultz is very well versed in PR of not only the Union Pacific, but also somewhat of MOPAC and the wonderful history of our Texas and Pacific Railroad. And at this time, we'd like to take this opportunity to welcome him and thank him for being with us today to bring us some good stuff about railroads.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the pleasure to be here and tell you something about this little railroad that had a very humble beginning, but it has turned out to be one of the major arteries of transportation in this end of the country.
All right.
Actually, the Texas Pacific began in a very humble way January 1858, when it was known then as the Texas Western Railroad. It had been granted a charter by the state of Texas. And of course, the charter stipulated that they had to begin operation on a particular period of time. So in order to meet the charter, the motive power to pull the train from Swanson's Landing to Marshall, Texas had not arrived. And on account of that, they had to, shall we say, turn to the best type of motor power at the time, which was ox teams. And that's where we got the history of the Texas Pacific, from ox teams to eagles.
All right, now while we're on that, would you like to show the little brochure that you have?
Yes,
that has from ox teams to eagles? And
this is the program, or the history of the Texas Pacific, that was produced and distributed on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the railroad. And it tells quite a bit in here. It gives some of the old-time pictures and tells about the progress of the railroad, building from east to west, and then of course up to Texarkana. This is a picture of the old Bull of the Woods locomotive. It was known down in East Texas as the Bull of the Woods because it never seemed to want to stay on the track. It would jump the track quite frequently. But then times have changed. And of course, as I started to say about the early beginnings, they had the ox teams. And so they would use the teams to pull the 3 flat cars up the hill from Swanson's Landing. And then when they were going down an incline, they would put the oxen on, they would stop the train, or the cars, put the oxen on top of the flat cars, and they'd roll down the hill. So that's really an humble beginning then.
that really is.
Later, the Texas Western was changed to the Southern Pacific, which is no connection with the present-day SP. However, that was the first major railroad in the area there. They had 66 miles of narrow gauge line. And when the Texas Pacific received its charter by a special act of the Congress of the United States in 1871, the first thing they did was to assume control of the SP's line from Marshall to, or from Shreveport and Swanson's Landing over to Longview. And they established their shops first at Hallsville, and it stayed there about 2 years, and then later everything was moved over to Marshall, Texas. So we have some pretty strong roots in Marshall, Texas. And then from from Marshall, they began to expand, and they pushed westward, and at the same time they were pushing up towards Texarkana. It's a rather diverse method of expansion, but that's the way they did at that time, because they wanted to connect with the line from the St. Louis area coming down to Texarkana, and they what we ultimately knew as the Transcontinental Road. They built that line from Texarkana by way of Sherman and Denton down through Fort Worth. And then at the same time, they were continuing the westward expansion into the Dallas area. And all of that was rather involved because money really wasn't overly plentiful at the time. The railroad had to depend on the gratuity of the citizens in the area that they were to serve. And of course, one of the reasons why they wanted this railroad along here is through the Congress. There was a cry for a southern transcontinental route, and this was the ideal location for it. It comes from through Texas across the 32nd parallel into California. Originally, that was their plans. By 1881 it was, Jay Gould, who was at the time president of the railroad, had completed the line all the way into Sierra Blanca. And of course, there he met with the Southern Pacific, building eastward out of California. And they had a little conflict there, which resulted in the Huntington-Gould Agreement, in which the Texas Pacific was granted the right to operate over the SP's line into El Paso, and it has remained that way even today. So it's really been involved as far as the operation of the railroad is concerned. Some time back, Mr. Don Watson and Steve Brown published this book, Texas and Pacific Ox Teams to Eagles. And they did a wonderful job in telling the history of the railroad, not only in telling the history, but also in producing a lot of photographs and things in there that a lot of people probably have never seen, like these. You see this train right here. We think that the streamlined coaches today are something new. They're not. The Texas Pacific had a streamlined train back there in the 30s.
In the 1930s?
In the 1930s.
Okay.
But the fallacy of that train was that it was rubber tired and it never would stay on the rails when it come to the crossings. Mm-hmm. It'd have a tendency to get off there.
Yes.
But it's a very interesting publication, and I would heartily recommend this to anybody who can see a copy at the library and get a chance to peruse it, because it tells a lot about the history of the T&P.
Wonderful. And that's by Mr. Don Watson.
Mr. Don Watson and Steve Brown. It was a joint venture. I was privileged to work with those gentlemen in producing the publication and going through back into my archives to develop a lot of interesting information.
All right, and you have some wonderful old photographs
Yes,
there.
this is the a view of the Texas, what we used to know as the Texas Eagle streamlined passenger train.
Mm-hmm. There's the beauty of...
And of course, this is another passenger train of the steam locomotive era, mm-hmm. in which, of course, we started out burning wood. Later, the railroad went to coal. And when we got to this far along, we were burning oil.
Oil.
So the coal didn't stay with us very long.
Now that's an unusual one.
Yes, this is what they refer to as an 06-aught locomotive.
Would you turn that where our camera can pick
it's
that up a little better?
A very
Good.
short little job. It could be used either in switching operations or some very minor operations over the road. Here again is the 900 locomotive getting ready to move out of the terminal at Fort Worth going east. This was number 16 passenger locomotive. A beautiful job.
All right.
Here again is the Texas Pacific, as it's shown down there in East Texas, getting ready to move out. Probably a lot of the people today in this area don't remember this particular shot, but we had a number of these trains like this. This is what we call the oil trains, moving out of the Permian Basin, bringing the oil into the East Texas area for storage. This was back in the late 1940s, early 1950s.
Okay.
And of course, this is one of our locomotives that was in military service. If you see the U.S. on the side of the tender there. Mm-hmm. And this one here is a rather unusual train, passenger locomotive, and there's a 500 series, but we didn't use those too much. This, of course, is number 82, and if you notice, it has two lead trucks in front, and then two followed by another pair of pony trucks. Then you had 6 drivers, 3 on each side there, and no trailing trucks at all there, pulling the old time.
But now this is the one that we're particularly interested in. Let's have a little story about that one, would you, Mr. Schulz?
This one here, engine number 20. Now this is not a photograph because at the time we didn't have photographs on the railroad. Mm-hmm. But this is a result of an architect's drawing of engine 20, which pulled the first train into the city of Fort Worth back in 1876.
From where?
From Dallas.
From Dallas, the first one then apparently that went right through Grand Prairie, Texas.
Right through Grand Prairie, going on into the city of Fort Worth. Mm-hmm. And it's this was, as you notice up here in the tender, it has the wooden logs there. So we were using wood at the time.
Yes. I noticed in some of the archives that I had that the Fort Worth paper did pick up that 1106 or 1123 on the 19th
1123.
Yes.
Yeah,
1123 on July the 19th, 1876, engine number 20 came into Fort Worth, Texas from Dallas.
That's
so
right.
We don't know exactly how fast that train traveled, but it should have come through Grand Prairie sometime between 9 and 10, shouldn't it?
I would think it did, because at that time, I don't believe your locomotives would be traveling more than, say, 20 miles an hour at the most. Mm-hmm. Because those little engines, they didn't have the speed, they didn't have the get-up that what we have in motor power today.
What we would really like is a photograph of that as it came through Grand Prairie. I understand all of the people came in their wagons and in their buggies to see this very exciting event happening in Grand Prairie.
Yes, they did.
And of course we weren't there.
No.
And we don't have any photographs of it. That's sad.
That's the unfortunate part about it. But
yes.
We do have things like this which really help us remember there.
Yes.
Just like in Mr. Watson's book, Six Steams to Eagles there, we have those old-time photographs which we can still rely on to a certain extent.
I think we have artists and graphic artists that are capable of taking a photograph such as this and superimposing a crowd of Grand Prairians, and I think we'll have to come up with something like that in order to bridge that gap.
Yes, they could probably do that.
Okay. Now, what else do you have? This is very interesting.
I wanted to show you these annual reports. These are bound copies. As you know, they're kind of beat up there because down through the years, these are over 100 years old. This one dates back from 1872.
And that's a bound copy of what?
The first annual report of the Texas and Pacific Railroad.
Of the original?
Of the original, yes.
How wonderful.
It goes way back. It even has maps in here, and of course, if I could get these maps together here, but
don't do that.
They still indicate on these maps that Oklahoma is Indian territory. So, and a lot of the territory west of Grand Prairie, west of Fort Worth, is still kind of void of any real activity as far as stations allocation is concerned. And of course, one of the things I like about these books is that they will contain information in here that you won't find anywhere else. In other words, they are documents of the happenings of the time. You probably wouldn't even find these in the local newspaper, because the people who were in charge of the various departments would write out their findings. Like, for example, land development, they tell about how many industries came in. And incidentally, that was one of the reasons why the railroads have played an important role in the development of this country, is because they were able to provide transportation for the raw materials and the finished products. And without your transportation at that time, it didn't do any good to have commercial venture if you couldn't transport them.
Well, Mr. Schultz, I do have something here that I thought maybe our viewing audience might be interested in, and while you're here, we'll show and tell this. This is the plat of the town of Deckman, which is now called Grand Prairie, Texas. And if our camera can pick this up, this is the original town site. And all of the blocks that are in color on this are the yellow and the green, are the blocks that Mr. Deckman deeded to the railroad, to the T&P Railroad, if they would bring the railroad through his town of Deckman. They did that, and then a copy of the deed to the railroad is also attached, where he did deed those lots, A, B, C, and D, to the railroad, and every other block, or every other block in the downtown site, he deeded to the railroad and brought it through here. So I thought that was an interesting piece of information.
That's very good.
This original plat, the hard copy, is in the records of Dallas County. They will not let us bring those out, so we only have a prototype. We have a photo of these, but one day we hope to maybe get a replica of that original plat, and we'll color it up like this for the citizens of Grand Prairie to know. But there's one thing we don't have. We do not know when the town exactly was changed, the name from Deckman to Grand Prairie, and do you have anything to shed on that?
I don't have the official date on it. The story has always been that the train stopped for some reason out here, and a young lady got off and commented, "My, what a Grand Prairie."
All right, and Mr.
And the railroad seemed to take it over, and they decided, well, that'll be shown on our station timetables and station lists. And I think the city, well, at the town of Grand Prairie, Deckman at the time went along with the idea, which I think is a good idea.
I understand that Mr. A.C. Green, our historian in Dallas County, discounts that and says that was strictly folklore, and that since Grand Prairie was in the large Grand Prairie that goes up into the Dakotas, that was the reason that the railroad probably gave it that name. And he's of that persuasion, and many of us that are historians are at odds as to why it really was changed, but we know when it was officially changed to Grand Prairie through the post office, so we're going to go with their date until we can find another date.
Their date.
All right, and tell us what you have here
This
now.
History of Grand Prairie,
yes,
by Marvin Vail, is another good publication there that contains some valuable information about the early days of Grand Prairie, and as you mentioned there, the deeding of the property to the railroad by Mr. Deckman. And it also has some old pictures there of early day Grand Prairie, which is most interesting there. So anybody who can get a copy of this, it would be worth their while to peruse it and familiarize themselves with the early history of their city.
one of your successors, Mr. Tice, who is with Union Pacific in Omaha, Nebraska, has been very wonderful in helping us to research. And he sent us a letter and told us how to get in touch with you. He also sent this wonderful, and I don't know whether our camera can pick this up or not. If you would hold me, hold that with me. Isn't that beautiful?
Beautiful.
If we can get that without the glare. Those are wonderful, but they're on an aluminum. It looks like a shiny background. But he gave those to us for our historical archives.
Yes.
And we're searching for all sorts of information, memorabilia, that we can start a little special archive to put in our museum for that. What else do you have to tell us about?
Well, I was going to show you here that during the operations of the railroad, of course, public relations in the railroad industry is rather young when I entered into it, because the department didn't start until about 1945. And when I came in there, we were in the process of issuing this Texas and Pacific Topics. It's a publication about things on the main line and the employees of the TNP. And this happened to be in the April 1950 issue, a reprint of a Trains magazine article, which points out the history of the Texas and Pacific.
How wonderful.
And it's written by David Morgan, who was, at the time was editor of the publication, and it's very well done and has a lot of good information there. I wanted to point out the fact that Texas and Pacific actually observed its 100th anniversary back in 1971. And at that time, on the occasion of its anniversary, they dedicated the digital computer-operated classification yard in Fort Worth. It's the west end of Fort Worth. Originally, the yard was known as Lancaster Yard because of the named by or after one of the presidents of the TNP, John L. Lancaster. But on the occasion here of the 100th anniversary, they renamed it Centennial Yard. It's one of the finest digital computer-operated classification yards in this end of the country.
And that is in Fort Worth?
In Fort Worth, on the west end there. And it handles anywhere from 5,000 to 6,000 cars a day, moving in and out of there, going east, west, north, and south. It's also very well known for its train makeup there.
I believe also in your archives about number 20 that left from Dallas to go to Fort Worth, that you even have the engineer's name and the conductor's name, many pieces of information that people would like to research.
Yes, somewhere in the archives those names are available. I don't have them with me though, but there's a lot of little details related to the early history of the TNP that...
Is there any Texas and Pacific Railroad museum anywhere in the United States or in North America?
Well, let me say this, that at one time, Everett DeGolyer Jr., son of the geologist, was very, very much interested in railroad history. And he accumulated quite a bit of the history of the TNP and put it in his archives over at SMU. Whether that is still available or not, I couldn't say. Now there's some information available through the Southwest Railroad Historical Society in Dallas. They have an exhibit over there on the grounds of the State Fair in Texas. And it's very interesting. Now, some years ago, I worked with the historian from Texas Tech University in Lubbock, and he came down, went through our files, and they put a lot of information about the early write-ups on the railroad and copies of vouchers and stuff, things like that. They put it on tape so it could have for posterity.
All right, do you remember the historian's name from Texas Tech?
Offhand, I don't.
That's
I imagine he's gone by now.
They should still have it in their archives,
yes, it will be in the archives. So that's three of the places that I know of. And of course, as I pointed out to you some time ago, Mr. Watson, even though he's in Canada, has accumulated quite a bit of information about the TNP. He's at up there at I think it's Montreal, Canada, and it's unusual that he should find that to be an interesting subject for him, being so far removed from it, because he, except for visits that he's made down here, he's really never had much to do with the railroad.
He's not been a railroad man, but he's had that very keen interest.
He really has.
Well, before you leave us, Mr. Schultz, I would like for the people in Grand Prairie to also see some archives that we have here. This is Mr. Seth Robb Walton Sr. and his daughter in front of the old depot in Grand Prairie, Texas, and this is in about 1923 or 24. And also, and I don't know whether we could ever pick this up, this is the Texas and Pacific water tank that was located there, that we have that. And also, this is the downtown Grand Prairie at the grade crossing at Center Street with the rails of not only the TNP, but also the interurban there. And this one's even going to be more difficult to pick up. This is 3 local gentlemen standing in front of the depot, and that will be very hard to see. That's very, very good. That's very, and also this one is inside the station, and this is Mr. George Doyle, who later became the mayor of Grand Prairie, Texas, and the other 2 gentlemen I've not been able to identify yet. But I thought Grand Prairie would like to know a little bit of a tie-in with the Texas and Pacific Railroad. And it said Grand Prairie, Texas has had only one major fire. In the early morning of March 26, 1909, a blaze originating in the Texas and Pacific Depot destroyed the depot and a block of buildings on the south side of Main Street. The buildings destroyed or damaged were the depot, and it names all of those, and we have these in our historical archives for anyone that would like to have them. Yes. All right, in about 1.5 minutes that we have, we want to thank you, Mr. Schultz, very much for being with us, and we'd like to thank Mrs. Schultz for giving us her time on the telephone to get in touch with you, and many things. And is there anything in your 1 minute you have left that you'd like to say to Grand Prairie?
The only thing that I can really think about right now is the fact that Grand Prairie and the Texas and Pacific, later the Missouri Pacific, then the Union Pacific, have grown together. And it looks like, judging from the expansion that I've noticed around town, the town has done well. The railroad has done well. So hand in hand, we're marching into the future. And I think it's a wonderful thing.
And as a retired PR regional director of Union Pacific, what do you do with your time in about half a minute?
Well, I do a lot of reading, I do a lot of yard work, and I do a lot of reminiscing about railroading. And I hear the whistle in the distance in the early morning, and it does kind of, shall we say, wake you up a little bit.
I want to thank you again for being with us, Mr. Schultz. It's been wonderful to give us this tie-in. We know how important the railroad was, what it brought to Grand Prairie, Texas. We want to thank you for your time.
It's my pleasure.
And this is Ruthie Jackson reminding you that history is as we live and do.